Welcome to another episode of Trees and Lines with Phil Charlton and I. Today, our guest is Bert Stewart, the Strategic Reliability Analytics Manager of Vegetation Strategy for National Grid. Bert, welcome.
Thank you very much.
Did I get that right?
You got it right.
I did? Okay, because you got a lot in that title.
I mean, the order might have been a little off, but that's okay. You got the gist of it, so all good.
Yeah. And so Bert's at National Grid. He's Massachusetts based. And Bert, I guess we have lots to talk about today. We're going to dive into technology and data analytics and, how you guys have made this very successful transition from cycle-based to condition-based approach. So do you want to start by just giving us a bit of your background, your time at Grid, et cetera?
I've really been focused on utility vegetation management pretty much my entire career. Started working for a tree contractor back in the mid 90s to late 90s, started off as residential commercial tree care, but then got transferred over to the utility division for that tree company, and really, frankly, never looked back. In college, I went to school thinking that I was going to be a forester or a park ranger for U.S. Forest Service or U.S. Park Service. And sitting through some of my classes, my freshman year, we had the opportunity to have guest speakers come in from different segments of the vegetation industry. And when a Army Corps of Engineer person came in and talked about their role, which was really appealing, really cool, then he started talking about salary. And then the utility arborist came in from a local utility company, and he started talking about his role, and again, very cool stuff that they did. And they got the salary. I'm like, like I may want to rethink this career path. And really, I ended up being fortunate to get hired by a investor-owned utility right out of college, and spent nearly 20 years with that utility here in New England. Learned quite a bit, worked with some exceptional people. And got an incredible amount of experience. 8 years ago, I had the opportunity to join National Grid. A colleague of mine that I would engage with over the years through my career was retiring, and he asked me, "Hey, you interested?" I said, "Sure, I'll come talk to you." 8 years later, here I am. The role has really been largely the same with National Grid. Geographic areas that I had and today I don't have. Such as the life of a utility company when you reorg and divest territories and acquire new territories. But one additional role that I did have really the privilege of having is reliability analytics. All right. So not necessarily a vegetation management focused group, but it dovetails with vegetation management in the utility world very, very well. Of course, we know trees are typically our number one cause of outages. We invest millions and millions and millions of dollars in trying to mitigate that. So having that group tied in with my vegetation strategy team, I thought was a perfect fit. And as a result, I was able to learn far more about reliability metrics, those impacts, and really how the vegetation piece really can be an opportunity to improve those. Comes with its challenges, no doubt, but certainly can be an opportunity to improve those metrics.
When we had a chance to meet in your neck of the woods, something I think that you shared that was really surprising to me was, and if I'm getting this wrong, correct me, but that Massachusetts has the most density of trees per square mile than anywhere else in the country. Was that right?
It is. Tree density in Massachusetts is one of the highest in the nation. Yeah, no doubt. So it does provide a challenge.
I want to dive right into this whole, and again, Phil's gonna laugh at me if I'm describing this incorrectly, and Phil chime in here. But as I've familiarized myself with the utility industry as it relates to vegetation management, it's clear to me that the industry is basically mostly on a cycle-based sort of approach in terms of how they manage their vegetation assets, right? And you guys, we're at the forefront of shifting to a little bit more of that condition-based analytical approach to how you want to approach your vegetation assets. So, when did that transition happen, and what led to that?
A time-based cycle approach is the best management practice in our business, right? There's no question about that. At National Grid, we have been doing a form of that approach for over 40 years consistently. In my prior role, working for Central Vermont Public Service, Green Mountain Power, same situation up there as well. Time-based approach for decades. Really, what kind of turned the page, or really made us pay attention and look at, leveraging different tools to take a more condition-based approach, right? And leveraging technology to help us with that. Frankly, we had some headwinds that is quite common, not just with National Grid, but really with a lot of utility companies out there. As we all know, the vegetation management contractor service, they have really a significant difficulty in acquiring resources, talent, people to do this work. It's getting harder and harder every day. One thing that I relay to folks that I talk with is, early in my career, 20 years ago, when I had the opportunity to work really close with our tree workers from our contractors workforce, was you see, say, 10 tree workers leave the business. Usually 9 of those would come right back. A lot of them would come back to the same exact vendor, same exact contractor. Maybe they come back to a different contractor and change the color of their shirt, color of their hat. The dynamic has shifted so much today that if you have 10 tree workers leave, you'd be lucky to see one of them come back in the industry. One, if you're lucky. So our contractors are investing more to keep the current talent they have, and they're investing more to try to recruit more talent. So as a result, that comes at a premium. And utility companies like National Grid are seeing those costs in the work that's being priced year on year. In a lot of cases, sometimes we'll see double-digit increases in a given year. Certainly not a sustainable model. There's things that do suffer as a result of that. And one of the things that suffered for us is our annual cyclical work plan, those miles that we prune. And as a result, we found ourselves pulling work off the work plan, deferring work, kicking the can down the road per se. And that certainly is not a sustainable strategy as well. We got to the point where we were deferring 10, 15% of our work plan. So that was really one catalyst that led us to looking at more of a condition-based approach. On top of that, at the same time, as all that was coming to a head, we had one of the worst reliability performance years at National Grid, specifically in our Massachusetts jurisdiction. We have a duration target of about 150 minutes. It's 147 minutes at the time. We more than doubled that in 2020. We had over 300 minutes of duration on average for the system, far exceeded our reliability targets set by our department, our DPU. So as a result, our executives, in particular, the vice president I reported to, they didn't want to repeat that. So we need to figure out how can we right the ship? How can we figure out to do vegetation in a better manner, leveraging data, because we are a data-rich company. All utilities are data-rich. But how can you bring all that together and leverage that to really get better insights and make decisions that are actionable? So there's a couple pieces there I hopefully we can dive into on the data versus making it actionable, because that is a gap a lot of people struggle with. But as far as the path of what led National Grid to really make a fundamental change from a long history of time-based approach on our vegetation management to condition-based approach with insights, that's really what led us there. Is those largely those two causes.
The time-based, I think, emerged in the 80s, and it made sense. But we've come a long way, and I am just so excited to see this, because I think the thought leaders like you are starting to move the industry away from time-based, and it's about time. It does take change, though. Did you have trouble bringing your team along board with that?
So when you look at my team, vegetation strategy, part of our role is really the R&D arm of vegetation management. So based on our charge within the organization, we got to think outside the box. We got to kind of look at what's out there for other opportunities that can really move the needle in the way we approach and approach our strategies, approach within the designs of our work plans, and ultimately the execution of those work plans. Even though we are quote unquote the R&D, folks of vegetation strategy for National Grid, there's certainly still some reluctance, right? Because it comes down to trust. Because we've been doing things a certain way for so long, they work. Perhaps maybe you get a little bit comfortable with it. That could be part of it too, but they've worked. But the key is recognizing, because we've done it that way for so long, does that really make it the right way to do it? Maybe, maybe not. But nonetheless, even within my organization and my team, there's still certainly, people are a suspect of technology and is it right? Now we look at our operations group that actually works with our contractors in the field. It is a big lift to get them on board to say, yeah, this is the way we're going to go. This is the change we're going to make. It takes time. And a lot of that time is exposing our staff to the technology, to the outputs, and then validating those outputs. We've been using a condition-based approach now for over 2 years, with about 1.5 years of actual execution in the field. We still validate. Matter of fact, we're going out next week in the field to do more validation on the data and the outputs that we get from our vendor. It does take time, it does take effort, but it's needed. If you don't trust the information, if you don't trust the outputs, you're not going to go very far with it.
So do you have a maximum a tolerance limit, or is what they would refer to? But so you can defer some circuits, accelerate some, or whatever your scheduling unit is. Is there a maximum?
Good question, Phil. So like any part of your program, you make your own business rules, based on the constraints that you are working with. And as a result, you could take technology and the output at face value, and it could push it out 8 years, push it out 9, 10 years. We as a company said, no, we don't want any of our circuits going longer than 7 years. All right. So we're managing some of that uncertainty or long-term risk by limiting the length that some of this work can go. Not to say that some of these circuits can't go 6, 7 years. Some can, but nonetheless, we just weren't comfortable to extend that out however far the model will dictate. Right? We did want to set rules on that, and there's certainly other business rules that we put in place as well within the model that we're using to make sure that we're capturing synergies and efficiencies. Right? Historically, we would bundle several circuits together as a package, and we put that out to bid to our contractors or award that to our contractors. Part of the optimization approach is you don't necessarily bundle those together anymore. They could be individual circuits, but there's still a risk in certain geographic areas that's not really all that efficient. You think about some of the smaller circuits in the city of Worcester, Massachusetts, for example. These could be 1/10 of a mile long, right? So these circuits don't have a lot of exposure. They're short. The concern is we don't want to forget about these, right? Because to do those coupled with other circuits in the area still does make sense. So we end up designing business rules within the model to say, if we're going to identify a circuit on this street, well, we want to incorporate these other smaller segments so we can get some sort of economies of scale as well when the contractor does go in there and do that. We don't want them in there for a day or two and then they got to travel an hour away to do their next job. That certainly doesn't make sense as well. So there's certainly some efficiencies that we recognize that we need to put in place.
Bert, since you're only a couple of years into this, you haven't really seen a full life cycle, right? Of, you have a limited data set, but in that limited data set, what are one or two of the things that you've experienced where you're like, we didn't expect that, or we didn't anticipate this, and wow, this poses a pretty complex challenge. I know you mentioned like some of these microcircuits, but what are one or two other things that have surprised you in a not so good way?
Identifying overhang. So tree density is pretty straightforward, especially if you're using satellite. It's pretty straightforward to get the density. But then when you get the measurements around the wire, that space and the vegetation encroachment within that space, the overhang was tough. What was interesting was it wasn't consistent. Certain geographic areas, and that could have been terrain issues. It had a little bit more difficult. The technology had a little bit more difficult time being at a high level of accuracy, identifying overhang. So that's information that we feed back to the vendor. They feed back within the model, and we continue again to do validation around that as well. So those changes that are being done with the vendor, is that actually resultant in better accuracy, right? Because it goes back to, again, being accurate, making sure that our resources, our stakeholders internally can trust the data. So that's key. So those are things that we found on the onset that were a little surprising, that they couldn't really decipher the overhang and that encroachment of overhang, because where a lot of the outages come from. They come from above. So it's really important to get that right.
Tell us how you're using technology to drive this.
If you recall, when we talked about kind of what was the path that led us to where we are today, and part of that was deferring the work because we couldn't afford to deliver the work plan as designed, right? So one year, I think it was 2018 or 19, we actually leveraged our data science group to help us make a decision on what work should we include, what work can we defer or push down the road. And we did that process. So we leveraged all of our data. We leveraged our GIS data, our outage data, the history of our vegetation management inputs. The one thing we lacked in doing that process internally, at least from my view, was the near real-time condition of vegetation adjacent to our overhead conductors. So we work with AI Dash on leveraging the optimized approach. And what they bring to the table, obviously, is ingesting all that information that I just mentioned, but they can capture the near real-time vegetation conditions around our assets. So that really is the game changer, whether you use satellite, whether you want to use LiDAR, you want to use Geiger mode LiDAR, or any other remote sensing technology that's available within our industry. That's the piece that really turns the ship in the right direction, is understanding what does that vegetation encroachment look like, the density. A lot of folks don't understand really what the density of vegetation is on their system. We recently acquired Western Power Delivery in the UK. And of course, when you acquire another utility company, you start benchmarking, right? You start talking to them and say, hey, what are you doing that's really cool? What are we doing that's really cool, or not? And you try to make comparisons, and you ask the question, what's your tree density? Oh, we don't know. They know how many spans have vegetation that requires work in the next 4 to 5 years, but they don't have an idea of trees per mile, right? They look at it an entirely different way. And a lot of utilities in North America don't necessarily understand their tree density and how that relates to impacts from a liability standpoint. So that's one thing that really has, enlightened us, is having that insight on the vegetation and frankly how it's changing as well out there.
So is it just about tree conditions? When you do your assessment and decide, the priority, what else do you factor in?
Yeah, so it really comes down to criticality. And when you're looking at criticality, the tree conditions are certainly a major part of that, significant part of that. But that's not, certainly to your point, Phil, that's not the only part, right? It's also about, how has that circuit or part of your system performed in recent history, right? Outages. Then you look at the assets that are out there, miles of overhead wire, miles of overhead bare wire. Is it bundled cable like Hendrix type construction, or is it open 3-phase, bare wire? Critical customers that are served on those circuits, right? So we feed that into the model as well, so we understand where our critical customers are. Our hospitals, shelters that may be occupied and utilized during major events, police, fire response, first responder customers. So all that's part of it too, and that all plays into really the criticality score of each individual circuit. And certainly that criticality score can change year on year based on really could be based on the way the wind blows. in the way it changes the integrity and health of your vegetation.
I just wanted to shift gears a little bit away from, obviously, like, you guys have a pretty thoughtful sort of approach, and it's iterative, and you've got technology providers and internal stakeholders. I mean, obviously utility environments can be very complex in terms of getting things to change and then building a sustainable process. Let's talk a little bit about the people side of it. How complex has that been to introduce this change and get all the different internal and external stakeholders on the same page and moving the ball down the field? The shift from time-based to condition-based, it's like a different cultural shift, right? And there's a different expectation of people that are providing the technology, your internal leadership, the field folks, everyone. So getting everybody on the same page to accept some of that change and execute it the way you guys want it, from plan to, getting the work actually done. How complex has that been? Getting everybody to kind of work together to get this to work? Because I could see that being, very complex for other utilities, and maybe that's why they don't make that transition, because the change management part is really the barrier, is the inertia.
What I found is that the key is getting all the stakeholders to the table, right? Getting the right stakeholders to the table. I can think back on other initiatives that have been done, throughout my career, where you make a lot of progress. You're building this solution out, or you're trying to resolve this problem. And then at a certain stage, you bring in additional stakeholders, and now you're far too down the line to really, to get that buy-in. You get the questions of, why weren't we included at the start, right? With this transformation of our vegetation management program, we work really hard trying to get our stakeholders in at an early stage. I will not sit here and say that bringing those stakeholders in at an early stage makes things easier. It doesn't, because they challenge every step of the way. Rightfully so. I challenge, even in my position, on on some of the items that we're working with and some of the outputs that we're seeing. I think it's appropriate. I think it's needed. But the key is really, to answer the question, is bringing the right people to the table, making sure that they have a voice, making sure that they have a decision, right? They're part of the decision. Because at the end of the day, if you can't get everybody in agreement, it's not gonna pass muster, and it's not gonna be utilized in the field.
I applaud you guys, because you're not a small utility, and in order to do that, to get everybody at the table and kind of grind through, to get where even you guys are today is hugely impressive. And so definitely, congrats on that positive movement. I know it's not perfect, but you're definitely leading the industry, I think, as one of the utilities that's made that transition, is making that transition. So that's pretty amazing. So
what about the managing up? Was it hard to get the executives to?
So that's a great
gears?
question, Phil. That is probably where we have some of the most support, right? Because one thing I will say about National Grid is we are all in on digital solutions. This company wants to leverage digital solutions, not just for vegetation management, for many aspects of our business. We have 3 or 4 significant digital evolution products going right now, in addition to our vegetation management optimization product. And the company is all in. Before we got started, we were chatting about a meeting that I had the honor of being a part of on Wednesday. We had an executive showcase in Boston, where we had our CEO from the UK over and all his direct reports. And we had the opportunity to show them, what VMO is, and, kind of where we've been and where we're at today. And they were all very pleased, very supportive, asked great questions. But really the takeaway was, they want to see us leverage technology. They want us to leverage digital solutions to make us more nimble, not just for ourselves, but more nimble on behalf of our customers, right? Because that's at the end of the day, that's what it's all about. But my point is that, National Grid's all in on digital technology. We look at things as a buy, build, or hybrid approach when it comes to technology, and they're not afraid to do either. It's all about making the best decision for really the objective and the solution you're trying to achieve.
I'd like to go back and revisit something. You talked about your data-driven, but you did distinguish between data and actionable data. So can you explain that?
As I mentioned earlier, we partner with AI Dash, but I like to talk with, frankly, their competitors, right? I've had different levels of relationship with their competitors throughout the years, from remote sensing offerings to software, right? And I like to see kind of the evolution of how all that's working across those different vendors, because a lot of vendors out there have great analytics. They have beautiful dashboards that you can utilize that you can apply to your system. And I'll dive into these different dashboards with different vendors, whether it's a GE, IBM, or Liveo, or AI Dash, any of them. And I'll look at their information, and really after I review everything and kind of ask my questions and probe, one of my final questions is, okay, well, where do I push the button to get a plan, right? Where's the execute button? How do I get an extraction out of that wonderful analytics software database to give to our vegetation operations group or hand to a tree crew? Say, this is what you got to do, right? This is what's prioritized. And some people have that. A lot of them don't. And that's the piece that I think really, to a degree, holds back our industry on making that shift to leveraging the technology to help us optimize our approach. Right? It's about how do you build the trust, and then how do you make it actionable? Where's the button I push, right, to get my work plan?
You just gave everyone at AI Dash a lot of PTSD that you're constantly dating. I'm just kidding.
Always got to be looking.
Always got to be looking. We'll probably bring our chat to a bit of a close, Bert. But before we go, definitely want to kind of talk a little bit about your hobby. I don't even know if it's fair to call it just a hobby, but your passion about maple syrup is very near and dear to me because I'm Canadian, and I find myself, I think I'm a connoisseur of maple syrup. So what drove that interest, and how much time do you have put into that? 'Cause it's pretty awesome.
Passion. I don't know if passion is the right word. It's a bit of an addiction, but there could be worse addictions, I suppose. So as I mentioned earlier in my career, I spent nearly 20 years in Vermont, right? And when you're in Vermont, there's a couple things you do. You ski, you might chase white-tailed deer, or you might make maple syrup. And when I worked up there at Central Vermont Public Service, Green Mountain Power, a lot of colleagues made maple syrup. It was just kind of the thing people do. So I had the opportunity to spend a lot of time in different sugar houses with friends and helping out. And eventually you get the bug. You're like, hey, I got some trees on my property, I had 10 acres up there, and I looked around, and yeah, I got some nice sugar maples up here. And I ended up putting out 12 buckets. And then the next year I put out, I think, 30 buckets. And then I was up to like 65 buckets. And I said, you know what? This is stupid. I'm not chasing buckets anymore. Then I got into tubing, and all the maple tubing went up, and getting into about a couple hundred taps in Vermont. And then when we decided to make the move to National Grid and move back down to Massachusetts, it was very interesting because we're looking at a lot of properties, a lot of houses. And meanwhile, my wife's looking at the house, and I'm looking in the woods, right? So I'm looking for the next spot. I'm like, well, I'd like to keep this going because we made maple syrup up in Vermont for I think 7 or 8 years when we lived there. I got my 2 daughters involved quite a bit. They loved it. I got a picture of my 7-year-old daughter, 6 years old at the time, and she had this wheelbarrow, and I had this thing heaped with firewood for the evaporator, and she's wheeling that thing into the garage where I had the sugar house. And just memories like that, and I really wanted to continue those memories, right? So I do have a sugar house here on the property, a 12 by 16 sugar house, and the irony of it is I have more than double the number of taps here in Massachusetts than I did in Vermont. Things are set up a little bit better, a little bit more efficient here. I was able to learn a lot of things over those years too, and learn what not to do. So yeah, certainly got it going, and try to trying to make efficiencies where I can. I'm still out there working on the place. So, but yeah, it's like I said, I don't know if I call it a passion. It's a bit of addiction or obsession. But it's hard because you drive around and you're like, hey, there's some maples. Maybe I can knock on that person's door. And, that's all I see. Yeah, but no, it's a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun now for sure.
Well, Bert, thanks for making time today. This was a pretty informative chat. Great chat. Great seeing you. We'll definitely next time I'm up in Mass, we'll definitely come find you and try some of that maple syrup. So
looking forward to it.
Yeah, thanks,
All right,
Bert. I think a lot of utilities are going to be following you.
I hope so, Phil. It's a new best practice. I really believe that.
That's it for this episode of Trees and Lines, brought to you by Iapetus Holdings. If you like the show, please give us a 5-star rating on Apple or Spotify. If you have any questions or comments on any of our episodes or ideas for topics or guests, we'd love to hear from you. Please contact us at treesandlines@iapetusllc.com. We'll chat with you soon.